Before we begin, let me formally introduce the debaters that volunteered to have this demonstration debate. So our Prime Minister is Tish from Thailand University. Our leader of opposition is Blue Jay from Udom. Our Deputy Prime Minister is Sasia from Mahidol, MUIC. Our Deputy Leader of Opposition is Aviana from the Philippines. Our Government Whip is Jin from Anglo-Singapore International School. And our Opposition Whip is Nun from Sri Lanka. They are deciding on reply speaker, so one of them will be doing reply speaker, I'm not very sure. So I will pass it back to the chair of the law, which is Nat, our co-chief adjudicator.
So without further ado, on the motion, this House to repeal all laws and criminalize any form of speech, I would like to call upon the Prime Minister to start the debate.
Chairs, panelists, and judges, we think that too long people are marred by political correctness and being only to say because what they say must be correct. We believe that that's not what freedom of speech stands for, and what our side believes today is that freedom of speech means the ability to freely express yourself and freely to offend. Why does our side defend this? First of all, a few model mechanisms. One, we believe that we're not going to repeal laws that will cause direct quantifiable harms. For example, law that prevents slandering, defamation, and these sorts of very quantifiable assaults that results in one's personality. For example, if you were to defame me, and that would still be quantified as not as of direct harm, but not something that our side stands for. What our side stands for is repealing, for example, hate speeches, because it's morally ambiguous, because it's content ambiguous, and because it's very hard to determine a quantifiable harm. What we also support is freedom of speech mechanisms. For example, any sort of platform that will encourage you to freely express yourself, your opinions, whether it's positive or negative. What is freedom of speech? First of all, we think that freedom of speech means two things. First, the freedom to express yourself without limitations. This, for example, wouldn't mean that if you have a quantifiable biased mindset against this person and you want to express it online, we think that that's perfectly okay, and that's what our side stands for. Why we think this freedom to offend to a person, for example, is so important, right? Because we think that offense in and of itself is morally ambiguous. If I'm, for example, going to offend you, I won't have the agency to determine how much hurt or how much harm I'm causing to you, unlike other sort of things that the government criminalize, for example, direct assault or direct inflicting harm to someone. I will never have the agency and the liberty and the choice to determine how much harm I caused. But secondly, and more importantly, right, we think that offense changes over time. So for example, in the past, when we draw a parallel, feminist speeches used to be deemed offensive because they were something that was so unorthodox in society. But we think that as society progresses, and as the age of feminism rises, and as the age of tolerance comes to about, we think that morally ambiguous content is going to be blurred, and we think that that's something we need to resolve. But before I move on, yes, ma'am.
You're not okay with defamation because it causes harm to a person's career or personal life, but you're okay with hate speech. What line is really drawn? Because hate speech has led to the death of individuals in Jewish temples by neo-Nazis because of the occurrence of fighting words.
Man, if you're trying to mischaracterize me, you have to try a lot harder than that. We think defamation, one, is not something that's very fundamentally what we stand for, right? Defamation is extremely clear. If you're going to cause and say to someone that this person has been victim of crime before, this person has been accused of theft before, when it's very clearly that that person hasn't, we think that that's something we don't support. But what we support very clearly, when you're able to express yourself under a model, right, and saying that if yourself is going to be some form of a victim of like discrimination, and if I might discriminate you against that, then we still stand for that. But two reasons why. On side proposition, we're going to forward two arguments. First, the duty of the state, and second, political correctness. First argument, the duty of the state. It has to be clear on a clear question. When does the state criminalize? And we establish this on two main characteristics, right? When a state criminalizes an action. One, when it causes objective harm. This means that harm that can't just be an offense because it's not objective harm. Second reason when a state criminalizes someone is causing third-party harms. So for example, I criminalize murder because it very clearly will result in someone dying, and that's not yourself, right? Why do we think that not criminalizing any form of speech doesn't achieve these two sort of yardsticks? One, objective harm is inherently hard when you want to determine how much hurt you cause to a person's emotion. If someone tells me that because I'm Thai and therefore I can't succeed in the world, right, that will very much determine how much I can go against, how well prone I can go against his action. If I believe that that's the case, right, and I should go and further develop myself in order to prove him wrong, then we think that this sort of discussion will lead to greater self-advancement and self-development. But second and more importantly, that political correctness is an inherent flaw, an inherent problem in society. What we think, therefore, is the problem today is that in status quo, we often have people going about saying, let's criminalize hate speech, guys, because that's the only way to create better society, because we don't have people who are discriminatory, because we don't have people who are racist. Why we think that's a problem? Because just because we have people not saying racist things doesn't mean that they don't think racist things. Right? When you shove them and push the discussion underground, because if you're going to say and voice on a public platform, you'll be like jailed for it or you'll be fined for it. Right? We think this creates a very narrow echo chamber. And why is it so inherently the problem? Because you can't advance society forward. If the only echo chamber surrounds you and your friend, and you still continuously believe that, for example, Muslims might be evil, or for example, you have religious or racist sort of biased mindset, then we don't think that you're solving the problem by pushing the problem underground. But the more inherent harm to this is that politicians believe that they're doing the right thing already, that they're solving society just because society is so free of any form of racist or religiously offensive speeches. We think that's a problem because without this, because when you have continuously, and that's what side opposition needs to defend the status quo, right? We think that politicians will never get the problem or the solution right? Because on our side, on the comparative, two things will happen. One, we let politicians know that there's still people with this sort of mindset. And that's why they need further actions to resolve this. And two, we think that visibility is the most clearest form of expression. If you don't criminalize this sort of speeches, you allow them to express themselves, go online and correct misunderstandings and give them counter-narratives on why what you're believing right now is wrong. Because on their side, which they're defending people who still believe that the blacks are inherently evil, and that's why we believe that on side of this proposition, we're proud to take it.
Speakers go for 7 minutes, 5 seconds. 7:05. Thank you, Prime Minister. Now I'd like to call upon leader of opposition to open up the debate.
government came up and talked about how us blocking away free speech will eventually alter society, eventually stop society from driving forward. What we see is that it's government itself that has actually stopped a society from driving forward, right? What opposition stands for is that we stand for the freedom of speech. Of course, it's a right that individuals should have in case that it protects societies, right? We tell you that freedom of speech should be encouraged as long as it doesn't hurt other individuals, right? In that case, for example, that when Pitch came up and talked about how there's this case about individuals being hurt and all those kind of things, we see there's an inherent problem with her case, right? What we want is that we cannot change individuals from their beliefs, right? That's a fact. We can't change individuals from believing what they already believed in. But what opposition is striving for in today's debate is that we stop those individuals from spreading those ideologies, right? That we stop individuals that are racist from attacking black community and all those kind of things, right? We don't want, in the end of the day, the neo-Nazism, in the end, go into Jewish church and praise things and do things that eventually harmful that, sit down please, eventually harms Jewish people in that church. And we think that is the yardstick that they haven't covered, and we think that's an inherent problem with that case. So what opposition will we be talking about today, right? Opposition will be talking about how, firstly, how allowing freedom of speech, how allowing this kind of, not criminalizing this kind of speech would eventually protect vulnerable people in a society that's going to be abused in the end of the day, right? Secondly, how allowing these laws to continue on would eventually stop entirely social behavior. And what my second speaker will be talking about is how freedom of speech can never be absolute in the end, and secondly, how it detracts society from development, right? So first, argumentation. How these laws in the status quo protects vulnerable people from being abused. So first level, let's talk about characterization of what the status quo looks like, right? In the status quo, there's already banning of hate speech and all those kind of things, which we say is not ambiguous in the first place. We say that hate speech, when we're talking about, is when you directly affect other people because of your ideologies that are being spread in the community where there are political background and historical backgrounds that is going to be affected those individuals, right? We talk about the mentality of criminalizations in that case. We criminalize things that harms other individuals, right? What examples do we have to support or substantiate, right? First one, we talk about how in Germany, right, there are banning of signs of neo-Nazism and fascism because of a political background in the specific context. Right? And we tell you that those things must be banned because it affects other individuals. It harms other individuals before moving on.
Do you think that those neo-Nazi sentiments simply stop because people don't talk about them? Don't you think people need to talk about them to actually deal with them?
Because the fact that people don't talk about them, at least what we're trying to protect is that protect those things, protect those harmful things from reaching other people, right? If you're going to have an echo chamber in your own house, write your books, whatever, doing your speech to yourself, whatever, sure, that's fine. We allow that to happen. But what we don't allow is that allow those kind of words, those writings, those hate speech to reach other individuals. That's going to inherently harm them in the future, right? And prove to you later what paradigms that we create, right, in comparison. So second example we're going to talk about is how in the USA, right? In the USA, there's now insights of fighting words that eventually provokes violence. For example, where you're not allowed to go in a mosque church where there's Muslim people and then say things that are hurtful to them because it's a concept of captive audience, right? These individuals have no choice to hear and no choice to argue. They are forced to be listened to something that goes against their ideas and eventually harm their principles. Right? Or even about how they're not okay about having a KKK rally run in Compton, and also those type of things. We say that that's the free speech that they are upholding, right? And we think that's inherently harmful. But why are these speech laws so important that we must protect them, right? Because they protect individuals, most vulnerable individuals in the society, from being hurt, right? We think it's okay for freedom of speech to be a check and balance of the government, right? Of a higher authority. What we're not okay with is that free speech allow people to hurt people and a weaker link in the societies, right? If, for example, we're not okay with having us talking, sit down please, harming individuals, harming women and all those kind of things. For example, catcalling in Philippines, right? We're not okay with that. We're not okay with men around the streets whispering or or some sort of sexual harassing those women, because in the end of the day, that is the things that impedes the rights of the women to do other things, right? We tell you that that inherently harms women and stops them from achieving their goal and being who they are in the end of the day. We see that the free speech that they are upholding also involves certain thoughts of bullying and all those kind of things. We see that if individuals are free to talk whatever they want, and for example, bullies can happen on all those kind of things too. Sit down, please. And that would go on and harms and impedes the rights of other people. And therefore, we think that makes the government, it justifies for the government to take away those rights to protect the rights of the extremely vulnerable. Right? So what kind of world that government and opposition portrays, right? We tell you that opposition portrayed a world where we protect the most vulnerable individuals in the society from being hurt because of random hate speech from other individuals, right? Even if it's so ambiguous and we say that it hurts other individuals in the end of the day, we tell you that that's inherently harmful, right? We need to protect those individuals, where a government actually allows those individuals to be hurt, right? Where a government actually creates an individual who is going to be blocked from society, who's going to hide in themselves, or who are going to not be able to portray who they are, become who they want to become. We don't care if you're going to be pedophiles or anything, right? We tell you that it's going, as long as you don't spread those ideologies to it affects other individuals, right? And second argument, how allowing these kind of speech laws to continue would eventually stop anti-social behaviors. On the underlying principle of how speech laws are necessarily to keep other laws effective, right? So characterizations. First level, right? What does status quo look like? There are also other laws that we criminalize, right? In a real life, not revolving free speech in the first place. For example, laws that bans pedophilia and laws that bans child porn and violence and all those kind of things. But we see that there are certain speech laws that are also involved with that. For example, right? There are speech laws that, if, for example, under a government case, right, you allow speech laws to do whatever they want, which means you allow people to come up with a Facebook sites or other sites that eventually create guidelines of what pedophiles should do, create guidelines and promote those kind of ideologies, right? We think that is inherently harmful on their sides, right? And that's why we're proud to oppose. Thank you.
Problems, something I'll analyze in my speech later on the second argument, right? But more importantly, we tell you that the line is very clear. As much as you want to attack us on where's the line between defamation and hate speeches, we also ask them, right? Where exactly how do you exactly quantify or qualify what actually causes an offense to someone that is so life-threatening as they claim on their side, right? But let's clear off some housekeeping, right? First of all, we think defamation is a very different thing from free speech. Why? Because defamation laws apply specifically to individuals in the public realm, right? Whereby defamation directly affects their careers and livelihood. We're talking about people like politicians, etc., where legitimacy is important for them to survive, right? And therefore, all the harms coming from defamation are entirely quantifiable and entirely qualifiable. We don't think that's really the debate, right? But let's look at the main thing they provided for us in this debate. They wanted to protect the vulnerables in this debate, and the mechanism in which they provided to protect the vulnerables is simply to not talk about something, right? Recognize that neo-Nazis retain their neo-Nazi ideology even after they are censored from talking about it, right? What they create in a world is a world that's going to encourage neo-Nazis even more in their own echo chambers to resort to even more extreme measures to want to achieve the agenda, right? Because on their side, what they're going to feel like is that the state is directly attacking against them to actually do anything about it. But even in the best case about catcalling, right, where people actually feel harassment and stuff like that, within those cases, police who are patrolling those areas can actually identify that as a direct threat to the woman. Sit down, please. A direct threat to the woman as well, right? But in the very worst case scenario that the woman does feel oppressed, at the very least she's not able to speak up in our world, right? As compared to a world where probably in certain societies you will not even let her speak up at all, right? That is why freedom of speech is absolutely and necessary, crucial for any society to survive. So I'm going to prove two things in my speech, right? One, on why the state has no right to criminalize the very foundation it is actually founded upon, and secondly, on clashing with them, my second argument, why the other side that creates worse conditions for vulnerables to actually eventually be protected. So then, on the first argument, the freedom of speech is an absolutely necessary condition for democracies to exist. Why? Because the purpose of democracy is so that every voice in society actually matters, in the sense that everyone in society has equal agency to engage with big decisions that will influence them in the end. For example, state policies, right? Therefore, principally, for opposition to defend a world of censored speech is for them of state duty on their side when the state actually doesn't repeal any laws criminalizing free speech, right? But more importantly, panel, recognize that free speech fundamentally is about the right to offend. You don't need the freedom of speech to actually say the correct things, right? That's not what freedom of speech is about. Freedom of speech is the freedom to actually disagree with people to begin with, right? Because we think that this disagreement is important because contexts are always shifting, vulnerables are always shifting, people in society will always change in the livelihood conditions, right? Fundamentally, because of that, we must always allow all sorts of offense to happen in order for things to be, in order for progressive changes to happen. In other words, what they entrench on their side is the current systems of the discrimination that already exists, rather than actually dealing directly with them, because people cannot even talk about them anymore. The other side is unconstitutional because they're criminalizing any forms of rights that people have to engage with the government at the end of the day like this.
You said it was the right to offend. Do you then protect individuals who claim that Trump Care will make things cheaper even though it doesn't and it will cost more than 300,000 lives in America?
We don't have the ability to talk about that unless we actually have the freedom of speech to begin with, right? In their world, if Trump was in charge of the state, if Trump was in charge of deciding what is acceptable speech and what is not acceptable speech, the likelihood of Trump Care actually being so much more happening on their side is so much higher than ours, right? On our side, we are able then to go against that and not allow Trump to actually abuse any constitutional rights that exist in the American society. Now, second argument then. Why did he create an illusion of progress that further hurts the most vulnerable in their society? And this is where it clashes them directly about vulnerables and echo chamber, right? Understand, panel, that the problem with political correctness now is that it gives incentive for politicians to avoid the responsibilities they have to deal with debates and legislation in parliament simply by not allowing it to be talked about, right? And we think fundamentally all politicians have a perverse incentive to want to avoid their duty to represent the constituencies that they are representing. For example, oppressed minority groups like the ghettos of Harlem or the ghettos of Bronx. In the end of the day, what then happens on their side is that just because we don't talk about it anymore, that thing no longer becomes visible. What that then means is that in all forms of media, like social media, like a dominant media, these things no longer become issues for the public to discuss about. Insofar as these things are no longer issues like Black Lives Matter, for example, what then happens is that you no longer have any means to gain any social support or political support to pass through progressive legislations that will actually eventually improve their lives, right? On our world, we want the government government and we want all parliament to take responsibility of the current problems happening in society, and we have to be able to talk about them even if it means offense, right? Fundamentally then, what that means is that what is offensive one day can eventually become progressive legislation on the other day, right? Because a black person taking a bus just 40 years ago was considered an offense to most white population in America to begin with, right? And that is the world that's going to happen to that, right? That world then will be able to pass any form of progressive legislation. Why? Because biases will be entrenched under the veil of political correctness. Just because we don't talk about something doesn't mean something doesn't happen. But in the worst case scenario that's going to happen on their side, what happens is that all these extremist groups will be retreating into the echo chambers, where in order for their voices to be heard, they need to resort to much more extreme measures to be heard, right? That's how terrorism comes about. That's how people actually have to resort to more extreme violent means to have their voice heard. That's why neo-Nazis have to march on the streets or even rape girls that are Jews in order to get their points proven, because they were censored and because they weren't allowed to offend others. Panel, understand that we are the world that understands democracy. We are the world that understands that progress happens only with discourse, and they shatter whatever is left of those.
Speakers spoke for 7 minutes, 36 seconds. 7:36. Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister.
Freedom. Their side assumes that simply because you have political correctness policing, that individuals will be silenced, even individuals who fight for their civil rights. But what they fail to understand is that when you have limitations of rights in reality, we have reasonable limitations to these, right? It is okay for individuals to believe. It is the first clarification I want to make in this debate. It's okay for you to believe that neo-Nazism is a thing. It's not okay for you to enter a captive audience, meaning people cannot escape what you're saying, like a Jewish temple. Sure. While in status quo, they think that it's about individuals no longer objecting abortion or no longer objecting the right to not have abortion. But on our side, we allow these people to believe these things. But where do we draw the line in reality? In reality, you have fighting words laws and hate speech laws in America. An example of this is when you have a Planned Parenthood abortion clinic and there were individuals from extremist Christian groups who would go outside the building and have a noise barrage to shock the doctors to make it unable for them to perform abortions properly. What America did was that they made a freedom of speech law that prevents them from doing it from, let's say, around 5 kilometers away from the abortion clinic. And we think this protects vulnerable individuals because we are not silencing them. They are free to believe, but we're only giving people a space to ignore. Because if you have the right to say something, you also have the right to ignore what other people are saying to you, especially when it affects your right to mobility, your right to access a legal abortion, or your right to believe in your religion without being persecuted. Second clarification. On the other hand, it also helps democracy that there are limitations. Talk about, for example, the rise of populism and fake news, and the rise of Duterte and Trump in the Philippines and America. I'm going to argue this later on my second argument, but we think it helps democracy as well. Lastly, they say that political correctness has no standard. We think that the standard for political correctness isn't even what we're fighting for. We're fighting for reasonable laws that protect individual people. Now, since no one really drew the line, it's about time that I do it, right? The line in terms of protecting freedom of speech only lies in cases that we support where individuals use their civil rights to attack power structures more powerful than them. And we draw the line for abuse when they abuse the freedom of speech to attack individuals more vulnerable than them, right? So we're talking about individuals like women who are being harassed by catcalling. We're protecting individuals who want to practice their Jewish faith and Jewish temples without being harassed by neo-Nazis. Lastly, we think that not all harms are physical. Right? We think that when PM made the distinction that only physical things should be disallowed in status quo, we think that these things have real and tangible effects to a person's ability to practice and live a free life. Talk about the catcalling laws in the Philippines, where we don't care if these men or like disrespectful and horny bastards. We don't care. They can be that, but they cannot directly do it to a woman in the street where she is allowed to freely roam. The freedom of speech is limited as to assure that people have the right to practice their own freedoms within a same society, and that is what we are defending. I will argue two things in this debate. First, I will argue why it degrades societies and things that we have conceded to as a human society as good. First level of argumentation. We think that we protect democratic systems, especially those plagued by populism, when we prevent individuals from bombarding the marketplace of ideas with fake news and allegations. An example of this would be how individuals would boast, for example, how Duterte or Trump would be a strong man in politics, and it's okay if they offend Muslims, it's okay if they offend women. And we think that particular news that have circulated only led to the further bandwagoning effect of their success, even though these claims may not be true. We think that when you have limitations on speech laws, and when you prevent individuals from sharing fake news, may it be about vaccinations, environmental protections, or even politicians in question, you have to have a proper space for democracies to access facts and not just pure, unbiased, and false opinions. The reason of this is that governments are made to protect an individual's right to an informed democratic choice. You cannot have an informed democratic choice if you don't filter out fake news, if you don't filter out individuals who are using false claims in order to win elections or to win popularity contests. What does this particularly mean? You make democracies bandwagon, and you make democracies ineffective, and you take away an individual's right to information when you allow these false speeches to happen. Second level of analysis. We think that you even threaten individuals' rights to life, even using speech. How does this particularly happen? When manipulating data in terms of vaccination results, you have these people called anti-vaxxers in America who claim that vaccinations can cause autism, or that it's very bad for little children to get injected more than 20 times in less than 3 years. Well, scientific facts prove that vaccination no longer causes autism. It was just one strain of vaccines in 1994, that these things do not happen anymore. You still have people sharing the news and it causes autism. We believe that this is directly accountable for the effects that have happened. In America, you have the rise of measles that have never been seen in the past 20 years. So if normal populations only have 0.2% of measles, you now have towns and cities who have 20% of children plagued with measles. The worst part about this is that it can lead to brain damage in the future, and a lot of people go undiagnosed, and it's difficult for doctors to pinpoint a lot of these diseases because they haven't seen it in their lifetimes, because before this, people were following the rules for vaccination. What does this mean now? It means that you reduce herd immunity. Right? The more individuals you have vaccinated in the community, it means that they filter out people from infecting others. And we think that if this immunity goes down, you make children more vulnerable to getting these diseases. You make individuals get sick at the end of the day. You don't want this. And the abuse of freedom of speech is what directly caused this. It's sick, sit down. It's what directly caused this, because you don't disallow them from opposing this to begin with. We think the same effects also happen in climate change, but I'm not going to give you arguments for that debate. So lastly, right, and here's the principal argument. We think that the world should not kill ideas, but rather we think that speech can never be an absolute right. We think that the freedom of speech was granted to individuals in order to overpower overwhelming power structures like authoritarian regimes. And we think that these things have been successful. We think that the people power revolution in the Philippines and numerous peaceful democracies have been able to establish the use of freedom of speech without the oversensitivity of political correctness, and still overpower bad democracies and dictatorships. We are totally for that. But we think that the freedom of speech, and the reason why it has limitations, is because while we give people the power to fight against these regimes, we should also make sure that they don't use this power in order to protect ourselves from each other. I have never been prouder to oppose things.
7 minutes, 46 seconds. 7, 4, 6. Thank you. Leader of opposition. Now let's call on Gov't Whip.
Opposition side doesn't support any form of would lead to tangible harm to individuals. We've already made that clear since our very first speaker. So when they come up and tell us about how some people spread false news about vaccination causing autism, that is also something that we do not support at all, because obviously it leads to the death of children, or it leads to the death of children from being cured from certain very contagious diseases. That is something the proposition side doesn't support. What we're saying, and let me be clear about this, is that certain speech, like hate speech, has no clear line between what is subjective to an individual. You don't know what offends an individual and what doesn't offend another individual. It is subjective to the specific individual, and I will further elaborate this in my two clashes today. On the first clash, where do we draw the line between which speech we should ban or criminalize and which speech is allowed? What are we talking about in today's debate? And on the second clash, who better protects the vulnerable people in society, and who better enact change in the future? On the first clash, where do we draw the line? Opposition side came up and talked about how we draw the line when we harm those who are more vulnerable than us. We don't understand, number one, what they mean by those who are more vulnerable than us. Does that mean that people who are more sensitive than others are considered more vulnerable than the rest of us? That is, how is that any form of justified criteria to judge who should be punished and who shouldn't be punished? If they say the same thing, but they say it to the different people, then they get different consequences. That isn't what the law is like, right? There's no clear line to draw what is considered a crime and what is not considered a crime. We don't think that's what we support on proposition side. But number two, when they brought up about catcalling in Philippines and how that is harmful, we think that obviously can lead to tangible harm, such as they can be raped as a result of that catcalling. We think that is something that we can report to the police. That is something that we allow on proposition side. We don't think that is wrong. The problem is if we ban Please sit down. If we ban this ability for people to freely express their opinion, when they go to report it to police, police think that they're making up this false information. They don't take these women seriously, and that's when real harm actually happens in society. That's what we're trying to prevent, because we need women and society to be able to stand up to these people and say that they're wrong, to be able to argue back and directly tackle them on their point of view. That is what our side is standing for. Moving on to the second clash.
So you're okay with people catcalling women, but when they get raped, that's when you can call it a crime, not if they're afraid to go out of their homes.
We don't think that if there's any tangible harm that comes as a result of that catcalling, that's when we think that it should be criminalized. But if catcalling is just a blank speech with no action that's happening after that, then we don't think should be considered a crime. That is something that we think can generate meaningful discussion that can bring out further change in society, which I will talk about in my second clash, which is why our side better protect the most vulnerable in society. Proposition side say that they do so by preventing it from reaching these vulnerable individuals. Number one, on my first response, let's take them in their best case scenario, right? You prevent these people from saying it out in public, so these individuals don't have to deal with it on the street. But that doesn't mean that they don't know that other individuals still think that they still look at them as in a degrading way, still look at them as more inferior than them. It still causes the same emotion as you would feel when a person says it out in public. It causes the same amount of harm, but you bring no change under your side because you're no longer allowing discussion to happen, because no one can actually discuss that. It doesn't make them feel any better than they already do now, and that's why we don't think that their side is effective. So then what happens? This is when my first proposition speech comes into play about the idea of illusion, when you claim that you think you're actually doing something, but nothing's actually being done, right? That's why because no discussion occurs. Why is discussion so important? Because in the status quo, people think that problem like female discrimination towards female is no longer a problem after all the organic change that has happened over the last 50 years. That women already have the right to vote, that they're able to go to work. They think that enough has been done, and they're starting to lay back and starting to stop taking necessary actions, when in reality they still face a lot of discrimination. They still face a lot of inequality inside our society, and action needs to be taken. These actions can't be taken when you don't see visible harm, because people may think that it's just false rumor, that people are just basically making up information. You don't have real information or tangible facts that you can present to the government to pressure the government to pass laws to protect these women. That's when you actually harm these individuals, when you don't allow them to have this. They sit down. But on the second response on how their side will worsen this situation. Because the reason why people have all these biases, think that black individuals are more inferior than white individuals, is because they've been raised in a community where there's already an echo chamber. Your side further that echo chamber for the rest of their life because they aren't able to be exposed to other perspectives. They're constantly raised in a conservative community where everyone has the same opinion. Everyone thinks that black are less, more inferior, and you don't get exposed to other opinion. You don't allow their mentality to be challenged inside society, which is what is necessary in order for them to start changing and start considering maybe what I believed all along is morally wrong. Maybe what I believe all along can cause tangible harm to other individuals. That's when we actually cause change in society. When you have no exposure and you punish them, they don't understand what is wrong with what they did. It's like throwing a person who doesn't know that they did something wrong in jail without telling them why. You release them out into society and they still don't know why they're wrong. They still do the same thing over again because they don't understand. That's why discussion is so crucial when you try to tackle and take down their mentality. But moving on to the next point of opposition I brought up is that it's okay to believe things like black people are inferior, but it's not okay to force them to listen. And they gave an example of like going to a mosque and not allowing people to exit. That is not what we support because that's like holding them hostage in our area. That's already illegal in the status quo. There's already legal mechanism in place to ensure that these people are dealt with. So please don't mischaracterize our side. What our side aims to do is to ensure that discussion occur for real change to happen, for people to be able to pressure government to take action, and that's why we're very proud to propose.